We'll just start with a brief introduction of all the panelists. Paulina, do you want to start?
Sure, happy to. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
So Paulina Hill, I'm at a firm actually just down the street from here on Boylston Street called Omega. We are a Boston-based venture capital firm, about $1 billion, close to $1.5 billion under management now. Traditionally a crossover investor, focused primarily in biotherapeutics, although we've done some device and healthcare IT investments. And as many crossover funds, and as I'm sure we'll discuss today, we're progressively moving earlier and earlier, largely because of the insane valuations, but also because I think we're interested in company creation. And so been there since January. Prior to that, I was on the healthcare team at Polaris Partners, also a Boston-based venture firm for 7 years. Have a PhD in molecular medicine and a background in bioengineering. Spent some time at MIT with Bob Langer prior to joining or jumping into venture.
Great. Thank you. So I'm Nanda Shingari. I'm with the Novartis Venture Fund. I've been with the fund since January also of this year. And prior to that, I was in the development organization and also their preclinical organization. So I've been with Novartis a decent amount of time. The fund in itself, we are a mid-sized fund. We're independent from Novartis in the sense that we're not strategically aligned with them. The only thing we are strategically aligned on is the fact that we do not do any investments in medical devices. We usually focus on seed and Series A investments. And again, we're super interested in company creation.
Usman Iqbal. I'm a scientific advisor for Jules Fund. It's a mid-sized fund based off of North Carolina, and it's mostly centered on the Asia Pacific and China market, and broadly focuses on both therapeutics as well as medical devices. Most of my background has been in big biotech and big pharma. I'm a physician by background with formal training in health economics, outcomes, and patient-centered research. Some of my previous stint was in Sanofi as former head of oncology for global evidence and value development, and then at AstraZeneca for TA head and senior medical affairs leader for neuroscience. I've been in big pharma and small cap, and in roles of assessing medical value for early stage clinical programs and how we actually link proof of concept to proof of medical value. So have that kind of an end in mind approach. And that is something that is coming on really, really fast for early stage asset development. So happy to be here and talk about it.
Hi, Fiona Himpton. I work for UCB Ventures. We're a newly strategic.
Speaking in the microphone, please.
So Fiona Himpton, working for UCB Ventures. UCB Ventures is a new strategic corporate fund backed by UCB Pharma. We're, like Novartis, independent from the corporation, but strategic in the sense that we go in areas that are beyond where the company is today. So we're looking for very innovative modalities, biology, technologies that will have a true impact on unmet needs and patients. We invest in seed and Series A. Our team will come from, most of the team comes
Folks in the back can't hear
Sorry.
you guys.
So we invest in seed Series A. We're looking for new modalities and new biology in areas that impact neurology, immunology, muscle, and bone. The background of the team is a mix between scientists all the way to market access and commercialization. My background is commercial engineering and have worked on mainly phase 3 all the way to restructuring post-patent exclusivity.
And finally, me. I'm an associate with Novo Seeds, which is a team of Novo Holdings, and Novo Holdings is a big investor with offices in Copenhagen, Boston, and San Francisco. We have a total of about 60 billion assets under management, including Novo Nordisk, the pharma company. So we're not a corporate VC, and we're not investing strategically with Novo Nordisk, so we invest in all biotech areas. And the Novo Seeds team specifically invests in early stage, so seed Series A. And also we do a lot of company creation, mostly from research in Europe, but also some of it coming from the US too. So I guess we can start by maybe getting some of your thoughts on the current investment landscape, where we're seeing higher and higher valuations, higher and higher fundraisings. How do you see the current landscape?
Well, I think, like Paulina mentioned, and we're seeing a lot of funds are going earlier and earlier. We sort of started it with the sweet spot being Series A, and quite rapidly moved also looking at seeds and company creation. And you sort of see that general trend, I think, across the board.
I think that's absolutely correct. It makes sense to go on the early side. I think what's coming out to be a little different, and that other folks can talk about that, is how the funds are actually approaching asset selection. And I don't know if folks can hear me. So previously it was basically about asset differentiation at the molecular level, at the pathway level. And now there is that kind of due diligence that has an end-in-mind approach where, okay, you can have a drug, but at the end of the day, someone has to pay for it. And that reimbursement aspect is a very complex process right now with evolving healthcare. And so funds are right now very much focused on the fact that, okay, if it's going to be differentiating enough, okay, that's fine. Can it actually address the unmet needs? And when it comes to the unmet needs, it's a 3P perspective, the patient, the provider, as well as the payer. So there's that kind of complexity that is coming into that process. And from an early stage assessment standpoint, I think it's really important, and we can talk about that in detail, is to have that differentiation at the molecular level, but also have that end-in-mind approach, thinking about, can we actually develop the right drug for the right patient at the right time? And that's the most important perspective that is changing and being brought into the perspective right now, which wasn't there previously.
Right, and I think I'd just like to say, with Fiona mentioning that, you know, we're seeing the ticket prices that we're seeing in terms of the Series B type investment right now, they're a lot higher than they used to be a couple of years back. So with that in mind, we've actually, given that we're a mid-sized fund, we're actually moving earlier. We're like, definitely, Series A used to be our sweet spot, but now we're trying to even do company creation and build our own network of folks who we can deploy as operators to be able to help companies, to be able to help build companies, et cetera. So yeah, it's been a very dynamic and shifting landscape for the reasons that have been mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, I already commented on this before, but obviously, you know, very frothy environment for quite some time now, and as a result, funds like Omega that have traditionally been later stage investors are moving earlier and earlier, all the way to company creation. You know, when I was at Polaris, started in 2012, I mean, there was just no competition for deals, quite frankly. I mean, it was so easy to get into whatever deal we wanted to. Quite honestly now, the good deals and a lot of even crappy deals are competitive, right? And the valuations are astronomical. I mean, I'm sure it doesn't feel like that if for the entrepreneurs in the room, right? And I appreciate that. And I will say VCs still pass on a lot of stuff, so I can appreciate how it doesn't feel that way from your perspective. But from sort of comparing 2012 and Polaris days to now at Omega, you know, we have to move quickly on a deal, otherwise there's no chance we get in, you know, kind of almost at a risk of skimping on due diligence, right, to sort of commit having to do all the work that we would typically do. And it's a little, I mean, I think we'll get into this, but it's a dangerous place to be, right, because I think when that kind of stuff happens, that's when people start to make sort of shady or risky investments, and again, at high valuations, right, and there's sort of the potential for things to collapse on the back end of that.
Maybe we can stay with you, and I'll ask you, what do you think are the critical things that you look for in an early stage company?
Yeah, I mean, $1 million question, I think, especially for the entrepreneurs in the room. You know, I think it depends on what you define as early, right? Because I think early has become earlier and earlier now. So at the end of the day, for me, and I think, you know, hopefully my peers here will agree, it comes down to people, right? First and foremost, we back people. I remember when I was a postdoc in the Langer lab, and Bob Langer is a, you know, wonderful scientist, and he said the most important thing for any company to be backable and to succeed is the CEO, hands down. He's like, I don't care what the science is, and it was so sort of groundbreaking for me to hear that from an engineer and a scientist, where I thought, for sure, the science makes or breaks the day, but at the end of the day, it's the people that make or break a company, right? Because as we all know, science fails, drugs fail, clinical trials fail, and if you have a good team, they're able to anticipate that, pivot, you know, kind of shift priorities in a way where the company still exists, even if there's sort of negative data. So I would say team, and then innovation. I mean, are you doing something that's incremental, or are you truly doing something that's groundbreaking? And from my standpoint, if you're doing something groundbreaking, even if the markets turn, even if this sort of frothy atmosphere doesn't stick around, you're going to be at the top, right? As opposed to somewhere in the bottom where you're doing something, again, sort of a little bit better, but not much. So for me, that's always been the two things: team, and if they're doing something innovative, I'll place a bet.
So I think what I'd add to that is I agree, team and also innovation is paramount, but also having an idea of how you're actually going to convert that into a preclinical POC and as well as a clinical POC. Like, how are you going to get your proof of concepts out there? Because that would really determine what the length of the investment looks like, what your inflection points are going to look like, et cetera. So those are also key when we look at a potential asset or a potential platform, et cetera. Like, how are you actually going to go beyond, beyond the seed stage and develop your proof of concepts?
I couldn't agree more. Just to add to that, there's, depending on your profile and your pipeline and the diversity of that, when it comes to the team, there's another aspect that's important is to understand the ability to move from early stage to late stage, but then late stage to commercialization, because there comes a paradigm shift in the company psyche, as well as the talent pool and the challenges that the companies have to move from one milestone to another and one stage to another. And previously, it was the case where historically you would not have to have those situations. You would probably get acquired, or you would probably get partnered. But now when Big Pharma comes into the picture, that's a very complex due diligence process. And if you don't have that pricing and reimbursement aspect, chances are you're not likely to get partnered, and chances are you're not likely to get acquired. So you might have to actually launch a lot of those drugs on your own, which is happening in the last few years, where small caps have actually had to go and launch their drugs, and that has not been a very successful kind of a landscape. About 80% of the revenues that we've seen launched by those small cap companies haven't really met their target. So now that perspective is also really important in terms of the management's overall thinking. Do they have a plan B? Can they actually execute that, and do they really have the potential to bring in the new talent and bring that kind of a psyche of moving from a clinical to a commercial stage company, which are two very different paradigms.
Probably because we go very early. It starts with the science, so the science needs to be truly innovative and respond to an unmet need, because we believe that if you can make a difference where there's an unmet need, you'll get sort of the pricing and reimbursements and when we say truly innovative, it has to have an impact on the patient. So if you've got a new mode of action, but we're not going to be able to show that it really makes a difference versus current treatments, that wouldn't work for us. The people is important, but as we're really early stage, we also realize that some of those people need to come as the company grows, and we can support with that. So I'd say people really important to have someone that's open-minded, ready to listen, ready to realize that at some point you'll need to bring in new talents, more experienced talents, but it doesn't have to be there sort of from the start.
And from my perspective, I would also encourage you not to look for these huge populations and indications where you have no idea how you're going to specifically target a subpopulation. So I think in the early stage, we're seeing more and more companies have to start thinking early on about defining a very small, specific population where your new mechanism, your new biology is going to act, and then be able to understand exactly how we're going to drive that through the different clinical stages, understanding what the endpoints are, because we're seeing that that can be a significant bottleneck later down the road. So we want to see your thoughts and the way you're approaching that very early on. So be prepared for that kind of questions, I think, more and more. And I just wanted to switch a little bit to some of the other factors that are not related to the science, and that I know that Usman had some interesting thoughts on the patient journey. And I just thought recently about some of the cell therapies that we're seeing being applied to some of the patients. And if you really think about the way we give these therapies to patients, right, there's so many places where things can fail. Even to the point where a nurse has to carry some vial to the patient, right? This nurse is carrying in a very, very expensive vial. So she's probably going to be very nervous. What if things fall? So there's a lot of things that one needs to think about. And I think you had some interesting thoughts on the patient journey and a few other non-science related factors.
Yeah, and I'm glad you raised that question, where when you have an end-in-mind approach, you have to have a stakeholder-minded approach. And we call it now the 3 Ps, as I said, the patient, the provider, and the payer. And when it comes to the patient, mapping the patient journey previously was very high-level, 30,000-foot view exercise where you just go reach out to some focus groups and get some insights. Now, companies are heavily investing in the patient journey, which is a very rigorous exercise to get to every step of the process in terms of what the patients go through in this complex healthcare system. And digital medicine, as you would have heard everywhere, real-world evidence. Now we have the ability to tap into these data sets, the real-world evidence data set, the claims, the EMRs, the specialty labs, and we can link these data sets at the unique patient identified level to track patients across all sites of care. That's why one of the major investments that is happening in the data world is real-world evidence, and that sets the foundation for understanding how do patients actually move from detection to diagnosis to treatment to experiencing those health outcomes. And that information becomes the fundamental basis for a patient-centered trial design. And if you have a patient-centered trial design, you would address the needs of not just the patients, but also the payers as well as the providers. So that's why these buzzwords are coming up all along within Big Pharma, patient centricity. Not many of the folks actually understand what that is, but this is at the very fundamental level is being able to map the patient journey. Because detection and diagnosis, many of the times you have a treatment in rare diseases or in many of the situations, 50% of the times the population never even gets diagnosed. So if you're developing an asset, you would also have to think through, okay, how do you actually identify and crystallize those subpopulations? Who are those subpopulations? Because as you pointed it out, it's not the big populations, it's not the big tumors anymore. And those small populations it's very hard to reach out to those patients or to find those patients. So I think it's important to map the patient journey in terms of how they actually first get detected and diagnosed. What are the issues that the physicians face in terms of differential diagnosis? What are the issues that the patients actually face? And then one of the most important thing is what are the current treatments? Because the era of comparative effectiveness is really important, because if you're developing an early asset, you would want to see what the current treatment, what is the competitive landscape is doing, and being able to project your effect size. Because if you're not going to be able to develop an efficacy or an effect size that is higher or substantially higher than what the current competition actually delivers, then it would be, the overall pitch won't be that much effective, because the effect sizes matter at the end of the day, whether you have differentiation or not. So I think it's a series of process where knowing as much as possible about the patient journey and then bringing those insights back into the trial design is really, really important. One of the key examples that I would give is patients' quality of life. In cancer, you would not get reimbursed in Europe at any HTA level if you don't have quality of life information, if you don't have patient-reported outcome data. Because the issue is, yes, you're extending survival for 6 weeks, but if that survival is really not is actually substantiated by quality of life, payers are really not interested in reimbursing that. So at the early stage, you have to actually understand whether you would also have impact on quality of life. And if you don't understand what are the issues when it comes to patients' quality of life, you won't be able to incorporate that successfully into a clinical and regulatory process. That's just one example, but knowing as much information as possible at the early stage about the patient journey helps you set the stage for the foundation for early stage development, which in itself sets the stage for the direction for late stage development.
Any more comments on this particular topic? Otherwise, I think it would be interesting to get the perspective from a former VC and a traditional VC on when and why should a company approach you, what kind of homework they should do before doing that. Maybe we can start with Pauline.
Sure, happy to weigh in. I mean, it's like anything, right? I think the more you know and are prepared for the meeting, the better or the higher likelihood of success, right? So just as VCs do their due diligence on a company pre-meeting with them, I think we kind of expect to some level that someone will do that homework on us. I mean, I think the most important is kind of knowing one or two key members, or at least, you know, roughly who they are, right? And then what the portfolio company investments have been to date. Sometimes that information is easier to find than others. Like, for example, Omega is SEC registered, so we have a very skinny website. You kind of have to do a little bit of digging. But those are all publicly available things that you can find out with a little bit of homework. And, you know, I think at the end of the day, it comes down to relationships, right? So I think trying to foster a dialogue and a relationship over time, as opposed to just coming in and doing a pitch and having a very transactional conversation, always fares better than just sort of a one-off, here's my pitch, do you guys want to do this or not, right? So I would sort of think about getting close to a firm, thinking through which firms you would want to work with, right? And which partners in those firms you want to work with, because at the end of the day, it is like a marriage, right? And so you as the entrepreneur have to deal with this all the time, right? And some of us are less painful than others. All of us are pain in the ass, just to be fair. VCs are always pain in the ass, but so I think that is important, right? And then just sort of trying to think about it from a relationship standpoint as much as anything else.
Yeah, I think knowing what we invest in, like knowing our portfolio and where really our key investment like strategies kind of lie is a good thing. And also knowing, you know, where we aren't investing. Like, if you come to Novartis Venture Funds and you're investing in medical, you have a medical devices company, we're probably not the right fund for you. And in my mind, also knowing, like, one of the things we talked about was at what stage you're going to be coming. So if you're coming at a Series C, that's not going to be a partnership that will work. You need to go to a different fund. So knowing what you're actually looking to get from the fund is also great, because knowing if you want to be building a company versus like getting investments in terms of for later stage funding, it all depends on, you know, what you're looking to get out of funding.
Yeah, I'd say the same. I mean, the more you know about us before you approach us. Similarly, if it's a Series C, we're going to pass straight away. If you're in phase 2 or phase 3, we're going to pass as well, because it's too late stage for us. So the more you know about who to target before you approach, I think that's a good thing. I think also as you start building relationships with the various VCs, if you have the opportunity to think about what would a perfect syndicate look like for you, you can also influence that. And for example, for financial VCs, understanding which fund is going to invest in you, meaning how quickly they want to get out, have their return. All those things can have an impact on the journey that you're going to experience from an entrepreneur perspective.
So I think that the takeaway is do not spam investors with "dear sir" and then send it back, because you need to have a more tailored approach to that. Now I think a question that may be a bit hard. So what do you think makes a great team? And when we invest in early stages, how do you do the transition from that early stage, sometimes academic, to a more later stage kind of company?
Oh. Well, there's first passion about what you're working on, because through your passion, you're going to sell it to us, help us see your vision and how you want to get to the patients ultimately. Share a team that wants to sort of share the impact, but also be open to feedback, be prepared to understand what you're great at and where you might have gaps, and how you'll need to fill those gaps with different profiles over time. Yeah, I'd say that on a great team.
I'll add to that. I think there are two key elements that you would want to see. One is emotional intelligence, because that is something you would need at every stage of the process. You have to learn, embrace a lot of knowledge, information. Initially, you might be working with a bunch of scientists. As you move on, you're going to be introducing yourself to a lot of other disciplines, and those disciplines or those people think very differently, and how you actually bring people at the table and have that level of consensus, or at least have that kind of a majority compromise in terms of decision making is an art. and that actually sets the stage for success. And the second thing is, which I can't emphasize more, is thinking about the patient. You have to be patient-centric. One of the things that at least I learned at Amgen, which Amgen's value was, if you think about the patient, you automatically think about it. It's going to automatically help you make the best business decisions. And so if you think about the patient and how you can help patients, that's in itself is a scientific process. That in itself is an emotional process. And it feeds into your decision-making process. If you think about, okay, how this technology can actually meet the patient's needs, you will go about and actually understand what the patients go through. You will actually understand how the patients interface with the healthcare system. So without emphasizing more, I think if you're patient-centric, the chances are you would have that knowledge and that foundation to make it work for the patient. And if you can make it work for the patients, you can make it work for the business.
So I think the only thing I'd add, and I think it's something Fiona kind of mentioned already, is having flexibility, because things are never going to go the way you expect them to, and being able to deal with various challenges. Having a team that can deal with things like that and being flexible not only in receiving feedback and changing their direction, or understanding when it's time to change the guard, etc. These are all conversations that happen as the company grows, etc. So having that kind of flexibility really helps make a good team.
Yeah, I mean, passion, conviction, I think you heard that. Having a plan A, B, and C, because to the point that was just made, it never goes according to plan, and we as VCs wanted to, but we kind of know that that's not really what's going to happen, and we planned for that, and we want to back an entrepreneur who's not going to, crash and burn at the first sign of trouble, but who's going to be able to adapt and kind of problem solve and troubleshoot through that. I'd say another thing is communication. I mean, again, all these companies run into problems. It's never a straight line. The way that you, and this is what we're trying to gather in the early stages, or at least I try to gather in the early stages of due diligence, is what will a relationship and an investment into this company and this person look like? How communicative are they going to be along the way? Is it going to be, I'm going to come to the board meeting and then find out, oh crap? Or am I going to know along the way, hey, here's where we're doing really well, here's where we're running into trouble, and here's what we're going to need to solve for. It can cut both ways, right? I mean, if you're communicating the problems and are transparent with your VCs and your board members, then we can be helpful. If you're not, we're kind of useless, right? And so I think that's that communication piece, and being able to manage your board and your investors is an incredibly important tool, because again, there's going to be times when things go up and down.
So be open about your challenges, and also listen to the feedback that investors give you, because oftentimes we have a bird's eye view of the world, and when we ask a specific question or suggest something for you to do, there's a reason behind that, so take also that into consideration. We're seeing also a rise in a lot of biotech incubators and accelerators. It seems that every city needs to have one or multiple. I would be curious to know what's your opinion about these incubators. What's the role of them in the investment ecosystem? Are they good? Are they bad? What are your thoughts?
I'm happy to start if you want to change up the I think they play a really important part in the ecosystem. I think there's different ones, obviously different names, but I think at the end of the day, and I think probably some CEOs in here could agree with me, that being a startup CEO is a very lonely game, especially in the early days. We were a virtual team, we're a small team. And I think it's nice, when I was launching a few companies out of Polaris, and we were in Lab Central, which is as Lab Central was getting started, kudos to Johannes for figuring out that model and really catalyzing a bunch of others. But, I hired 2 scientists out of MIT, and their first time into a company, and it was nice for them to have that atmosphere, to be able to sort of go to lunch and grab a coffee and sort of, commiserate on some level, right? I think it's hard if you're sort of just, an independent space, very siloed. You're trying to network, but it's just tough, right? Because you go and do your day job and you're by yourself. So I think that sort of community and that ability to sort of be part of one thing, even though you're in an independent company, is a value that I really see is a strong part of this biotech incubator thing.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I think it provides entrepreneurs with a place to find other folks just like them who are going through the same challenges, and you can, that community is very, very helpful. And it also gives you a really great place to network because you have other folks who are different investors who are there, et cetera. So it's a really, really, from the folks we've worked with and the companies we've placed into incubators, it's been a really great experience for them.
And yeah, absolutely. And it also helps if you're, especially in a disease area which is new, where it's evolving, like gene therapy, cell therapies, and all of that, where you need broader consensus and you need broader input, and you need leadership in this space to navigate what's new, what we can actually hold off on, and actually move from there. So a new disease area, a new evolving space, that kind of sets the stage for this kind of arrangement. It actually gives you a head start and helps you move forward fast.
Yes, I think, I mean, the positives have been mentioned, the fact that you get, you're together, you can build on other people's relationship, you can ask advice. I'd say where I can sometimes see some pitfalls is, I mean, biotech's become sort of the priority for a lot of countries and regions. And so you have a lot of local incubators where there's a sort of a set number or a set budget that needs to be invested in companies every year. And that's where sometimes you see the quality the sort of being impacted more because there might not have been that many this year, but they need to have that number in the incubator. So yeah, it really depends on the location, on the science that's behind it.
So we've seen quite a lot of abundance of capital in the last 10 years, also relatively good IPO markets, so everything seems to be going up. Is this going to continue in this direction? What are your thoughts about the future and how will that impact investors and startups alike? Do you want to start, Paulina?
Sure. I wish I knew an answer to that. I mean, I would love for it to continue for eternity, but I think we all know that at some point there's probably going to be a bit of a correction. I think the question is when that correction is going to happen. You know, I think back 3 JP Morgans ago, and analysts and bankers were predicting that might be when it happens, and you know, to some degree it did, but then overall, I think if we look at it, obviously the prices are still where they are. There's some news with, and I don't know if how many of you guys saw this today, but Woodford and the fund that's happening with Woodford and how that's sort of driving down biotech valuations in general because people feel like they're overinflated. Check out the Endpoints article that was there today. So I know this isn't a good answer, but the answer is I don't know, right? But I think the only thing that we advise or I can advise or we can plan for collectively is be capital efficient, right? Just because the money's there, I mean, raise the money, right? But still be, you know, don't build a circular staircase in your, you know, biotech incubator or your whatever office, right? Be sort of prudent with your capital and hope for the best, plan for the worst, right? At the end of the day, you're going to have more cash in the balance sheet. You're going to need to raise less. You're going to get less diluted. I think that's a net positive, right? And if there is a market downturn and you can't raise, then at least you have a little bit of a cushion to go off of.
Yeah, I don't know what more to add on that because it's one of those things that you don't really know what's going to happen in the future, but we do expect there to be a correction at some point. And basically, like our advice to investors, just like our advice to the entrepreneurs right now, is that you know raise what you need, make sure you can get to that you know value inflection point. Because if you've been able to get the right amount of raise, you're able to get to that spot where you can show investors that you have something, they will still invest as long as there's something to invest in.
Yeah, I'll just add one of the political perspective. Keep an eye on the drug pricing and how that legislative landscape comes into play, because if that comes out to be functional and there is a broader effect on drug pricing, whether it's Medicare negotiating in terms of the drug pricing or there's some overarching effect, it can have that kind of not just a psychological but actually a functional impact on valuations as well as the way investors would actually see the future outlook of that. So I think the drug pricing and all of the lobbying that is happening, at least at the foundational level, is something that to look for, and it could actually impact what the future outlook is going to look like from the VC standpoint. We don't know how's that going to pan out, but I think it would become pretty clear in the next 12 to 18 months.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think, I mean, if there's a pricing change, that's going to have a direct impact and pretty immediate on your exits, which then will have a sort of a trickle-down effect very quickly all the way down to seed investments. I'd say what's sort of balancing that is there's a true need for innovation and for new molecules. So if you've got something that's strong scientifically and a great team, those will always be backed.
But I think that's where, plan for the worst is when it comes to pricing. That's why there's this concept of value-based innovation. So think about early on, it's not the mechanistic or the pathway or the molecular innovation. Are you really bringing innovation when it comes to the stakeholders' expectation, and which are the physicians, the providers, and the patients. The payers, the providers, and the patients. So that innovation and that molecular innovation has to be linked with value-based innovation for the stakeholders. So planning for the worst is, if there's a pricing impact, let's see how can we actually create value and differentiate for the stakeholders who are going to be the actual users of that technology.
And on that note, maybe we're going to open for a few questions. We have one right here.
I was curious to hear your perception on sort of tech investors coming into the biotech space and how you view them as potential investment partners.
I can comment on that. So when I was at Polaris, I started a company called Therapeutics, and Polaris seeded it, backed it, and then Andreessen Horowitz, out of their bio fund, led the Series A. And it's sort of a combo of bio and tech, mostly bio, but I think there are sort of IT, AI, machine learning components to it, where someone like an Andreessen can be very helpful. So, I think there's a lot of learnings in tech that maybe the biotech community could benefit from, right? In terms of business model, innovation, sort of rapid iteration on something, getting to revenue, which, as we all know, most biotech companies don't usually do. But I think you do have to tread cautiously, right? Because I think most of these firms don't have experience with clinical development, with drug development, with patient, payer, provider types of issues. So I think you just want to balance them out with someone who understands that, like some of the folks sitting here who really have a very strong and clear perspective on that. But I think they can, for the right company and the right stage, they can be tremendously valuable, and they have a lot of money, right? So I think that's the other benefit.
Yeah, I mean, nothing really more to add on that other than the fact that, it all depends on the syndicate that you go with, because having someone like that is very helpful, because for one, they bring a lot of capital into it, but also they bring this other aspect and other knowledge base. But you need to have like two components of biotech folks who've like had the experience, et cetera, to kind of complement that, so you're getting the right advice.
Yeah, I mean, these are two very different worlds, and the tech world doesn't really understand the complexity of the clinical development world, and it's a very, very different world. And the art is actually how we actually mesh these two disciplines to create synergy, and that synergy requires prior understanding and discussion on what's possible and what's not possible, because one of the perception that comes from that world is everything is possible. But what they don't understand is when you're dealing with human biology, everything is not possible. And it's 1 out of 10 drugs that actually make it to the market. And so it's a way two different cultures intersecting. And what we've seen so far is that lack of interface, lack of effective interface. But that doesn't mean we can't actually achieve that interface. And I think in the next few years we will be able to see that.
Yeah, I think as in any two areas, when there's a sort of an intersection, there's always new things that can happen that are unexpected and potentially good. And I think maybe we can start with areas that are not directly involved in human biology and disease and health. This could be things like DNA for data storage, right? It's where tech investors and biotech investors can meet and start having that relation, those conversations, understanding how these two different sort of types of investors talk, what's the lingo, and that can open up doors to investing in things like digital therapeutics, where you have a digital medicine is not a real pill, but needs to go through the clinical trials as a normal pill. So I think in those areas we'll see a lot of benefit, and I think in the coming 5 years we'll see a lot of stuff happening in that space. More questions? Rob?
Yeah, so if you're ready to do a Series A with an early company, is there a sweet spot range in terms of how much you want to invest? And also, what are you ideally looking to get back from that Series A investment?
So do you mean sort of how much each individual VC is going to invest? 'Cause
Well,
that
yeah, I
would
mean, are
probably
you
have
looking to take control of the company? Is this the goal at a Series A, or?
So, and this is going to be
Yeah.
different for every, so for example, for us, I mean, we don't take control. As a corporate venture, we don't want to be sort of
Yeah.
owning more than 50.
Yeah.
So we have our sweet spot from a ticket size is probably 5. We can go up to 10 for a single round. And sort of what we're looking for in a Series A goes back to sort of some of the comments that we mentioned before. So sort of innovative science that we really want to help bring to patients. We invest in equity. We don't take any rights. And we're similar to other investors from that perspective.
Yeah, so usually for a Series A, we similarly, like we usually syndicate those deals. We don't, we may lead them and help build a syndicate, et cetera, but we won't be looking to take over the company in any way. In similar ticket size, 5 to 10, and we generally like to sit on the board of the companies as well, because we'd like to be able to help with the shaping of the strategy and working with the folks to be able to then figure out what are the next steps would look like.
But you might have, you have some bigger financial funds who will want to take a much bigger chunk in the lead syndicate.
Maybe I just jump in. Oftentimes when we invest, we're oftentimes the lead investor because we do a lot of company creation. And I think obviously we want to have appropriate controls there just because we're not just bringing the money to the table, we're bringing the expertise and all these years in building these companies, and that also has value. And I think when we discuss with the startups and they raise this Series A, there's an understanding that we're in together to building this potential company. And obviously, if there's no controls in place, and if you cannot control the direction of a certain company, then it becomes really hard for you to decide where the company is going to go. And obviously, at the end of the day, it will be always a discussion, and we're there to help the company reach the market.
I'm intrigued by the idea of the VCs getting earlier into the company creation stage. So I'm the Chief Venture Officer at WARF, Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation. We manage intellectual property for the University of Wisconsin-Madison. We've got about $200 million in innovation capital to develop our technologies, $50 million of which is for therapeutic targets to be developed with preclinical data, partnering with CROs, keeping the targets from being published, keeping it somewhat proprietary, to develop them into therapeutic leads. We're looking for partners, in addition to the CROs we're partnering with, to help us in company creation. We're trying to fund that gap between target to therapeutic compounding. What stage do you guys get involved with in programs like that, if that kind of a program would be interesting to you?
So maybe I'll just start, because we, as Noble Seeds, we do a lot of company creation, so we have 2 mechanisms on the very early stage. One of them is about $100,000, and the next one is $500,000. That sort of allows you to do these few key experiments, to do some experiments as CRO. So we do that, and then after that stage, and if everything gets validated, then we do a seed round that's relatively small, could be 3 to 5 million, to further validate the research, get a team in place, think about the strategy, the indications, all of that. And then after that, we go in and we do a bigger Series A to move things through clinical trials. But that's us, and we don't have to raise a fund every 4 or 5 years, so we have a longer term horizon. We have plenty of capital to invest. So this is the way we operate.
So for us, we'd like to have some preclinical data, and then once we have some preclinical data showing some kind of proof of concept, we kind of come in and try to, figure out if what would the next step look like. We would actually help with the seed syndicate building, et cetera, and trying to build a company from the ground up, and then going on to figuring out what the Series A strategy.
Yeah, I'd say we're very similar, so.
We would mostly invest in when there's an early clinical signal.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great that you have all this non-dilutive capital. I think that's always a benefit to leverage equity dollars. I guess, would the company need to stay in Wisconsin, or is it, if I'm...
No state ties, no state money, I don't need to create jobs. I'd love it if the technology gets commercial wherever. Mumbai, Tokyo.
Yeah, so I think, you know, from my standpoint, we're always looking for early stage academic assets or sort of chemical matter or, you know, technology to put into companies that we are starting, right? Maybe it's not necessarily the foundation of what we would build a company around, but it's always nice to layer on as part of a preclinical pipeline. So certainly if there's sort of early proof of concept, I mean, I think sort of there's a varying early, right? Then, you know, happy to have those conversations because we're always looking for those types of assets and relationships.
More questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was seated at a recent event with half a dozen VCs like yourselves who are doing early stage investment, and their opinion was that university research, preclinical, can't be trusted, and that they start their due diligence by hiring 1 to 3 independent labs to try and repeat data. And I'm curious if you share that view and if you could comment on your due diligence on early stage work.
So I wouldn't necessarily say it can't be trusted. I like to have a more optimistic view of the academics. But I do think a lot of, I think maybe a different way of saying it is a lot of data from academic labs can't be repeated, right? And I think that's always been the case, right? I remember when I was doing my grad school and postdoc work, you have a nice figure, and you're like, yes, that goes in the publication, right? So I think for sure venture firms are always sort of in the business of like, let's independently repeat this, right? To really make sure that that is real. And either that's done before we invest, or that's why a lot of these opportunities are being taken in-house, right? And sort of created in-house once there's some validation. Or maybe it's a tranched milestone type of thing, where once this is repeated independently, then the next drawdown happens. But I think it's obviously the case that a lot of things can't be sort of replicated, and we're always trying to figure out what's real and what's not.
Right, for us, like seed stage is that, like being able to bring academic work and, you know, and trying to see if we can repeat it and you're able to get the signal and then you move on. So it's something you do just to be able to assess. But I don't know if it's not to be trusted, it's just, can you repeat it?
Yeah, if there will be no trust, we won't do anything.
Exactly, there's no capital behind
So
it.
if we do those extra experiments, it's because we think that the science is exciting, and we just want to validate further, because in a lab, maybe you do n equals to 3 or 5, you cannot do n equals to 20, and we want to have that further validation. Okay, a few more questions? Yeah, go ahead.
How would you look at clinical stage assets? I know, Fiona, you said that you're not interested in phase 2 or phase 3 assets, but one of the best ways to get a patient-centric approach, to get drugs into patients quickly, is starting with a quality drug that has been already advanced. So if you had something that could be advanced in the clinic, that's at phase 2 or phase 3 and is within your capital requirements, is that something you would not look at because it's no longer early stage?
Yeah, no, so in our case, for us that would be more a BD opportunity for the pharma company. So if it's an interesting asset, we can easily introduce you to our BD teams. But yeah, our aim is not to compete with the corporation, and that's late. I mean, that's quite late stage. Be very quickly needing to go to market. So it's out of our scope.
Yeah,
And
it's
do the
exactly
funds feel the same way?
Yeah, it's exactly the same for us, but we're also a corporate fund that we, you know, anytime you come to us with a phase 2, phase 3, we will refer you to our BD folks and they will take on, because you need a significant amount of due diligence at that point in time and you need like the right experts around the table. So we try to make sure that you get those meetings.
And in the case of Novo Holdings, my team doesn't do that, but we have the Novo Ventures team, we have a growth equity team that invests across the different stages. So we would also invest in that kind of, which is not my team. Yeah.
Well, so everybody, strongly agreed that valuations are high, you know, in public markets, oh, the PE ratios are 50, oh, they're 20, that's historically. What is the ratio, what are the 2 or 3 things that make you say, wow, early stage stuff, which doesn't have a cash flow, doesn't have profits, what is it that says, wow, they're higher, as opposed to, it's fine, it's a 20 PE, or it's an 18 PE? Are there a couple of things that you would look at to say, you know, that compared to 3 years ago, it's high?
If you're first in class, potentially best in class, that would drive the ratio right away.
But there can't be fewer best in class than there were 3 years ago.
Then it becomes a complex model.
It's not back south from an exit multiple?
No, we're dealing with a lot of variables. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's also, we just compare to what it was before. So for a seed investment, what was the pre-value of something similar? And it's, yeah, some of them.
So it's comps.
Maybe.
Yeah, it's just comps. Comps have just gone up significantly in the Bs and the Cs now.
One last question? Yeah?
Yeah, actually, to sort of riff on the question you asked earlier about, phase 2, phase 3, what about situations in which a drug may have already been a patient on an emergent IND or some similar situation, perhaps a research trial? How do the funds view that? Do they still view it as sort of too late for you to get in, or is it viewed as an asset?
So I'm sorry, I couldn't hear your question.
Yeah. Essentially, what happens if the drug has already been on patients in an emergent IND or some situation like that? So it's been used in a single patient or a couple of patients for compassionate use or compassionate care or emergent INDs.
Yeah, so I mean, Omega invests in clinical stage assets all day long, similar to an OrbiMed or an RA or a Bain. So I think, you know, we were in the Series A of Juno, and one of the reasons we were in the Series A of Juno is because we had conviction around the clinical data, right? So I think if you have that, and you're talking to a clinical stage investor, that can only help you, right? The more data of that data you have, the better.
The issue is when if you have a compassionate use, inherently you're at the kind of at a later stage. So, but if you have more of that, that means you have more clinical data and you have more to work that doesn't certainly help to provide you more information when it comes to your decision making.
All right, thank you. Hope you have the rest of the conference.